Okay, hello again. I first would like to congratulate Ryan Werner and his gang from Next Day Video for actually making the tech work. I plug it in, it works. That's open source hardware doing that, just letting you know. This is awesome, because how often does tech not work? Okay, I'm probably... Okay, just a question for the video people. Would it be okay for me to run around there, or do you get a bit stressed about that? Would you prefer me to stand here? Okay, I will get really stressed standing here. I'm a run-arounder, so okay. Okay, we'll see. I'll try not to fall down when I do. Okay, so I'm going to have a bit of a rant, but I've got the evidence to back it up. I also think that I'm probably preaching to the converted in this room. However, it's getting recorded, and that makes it very, very useful in other spaces. But to very quickly map this back where I'm going is, some of you have come to linux.conf for many, many, many years. This is my 15th linux.conf. There have been 21. There's people who've been here for 21 times. 15 years ago, there were still people who were saying, Linux is better, you should run it. And we all know that that argument actually doesn't work. So we've kind of adapted from that. And the fact that there is cool tech that is perhaps better doesn't mean that we actually all now have to use it. It's like when you have a new screwdriver, you want to apply it to everything. So if you are a screwdriver, everything starts looking like a screw. If you are a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And that's a really bad idea. And I'll give you some examples of this along the way. So I'm actually going to have a little rant against gratuitous tech in classrooms, schools, just in general there. And I think dreadful things are happening there. So to start with, I'm going to back up a bit and tell you a tiny bit of my history so you know where I come from, because I'm pretty old. That on the left is the first computer I learned to do programming on. That's actually a fancy model. It's a PDP-8 built into a VT78 terminal, both from DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation. So I said that's the fancy model. The non-fancy model, which is just a bunch of discrete circuit boards, no integrated circuitry, is actually sitting to the left of Chirac in the Melbourne Museum as one of its places. It is that old. This is like 1968 stuff. The one I used actually had 8-inch floppy drives and a line printer. It was awesome. One of the first things my friend and I did with it, once we actually got the hang of it, the basic was awful, so we figured out how to use the machine language, which was literally the machine language. There was no assembler, so we had to assemble the codes ourselves in Octal, and we built Pac-Man, because that's what you do. Point is, we were tinkering, and that's one of those things. My first home computer was that dreadful piece of junk, a Sinclair ZX80. God, it was awful. Absolutely, there's cheering from Steve Dalton in the back. Yeah, they were fabulous, but they were awful. I don't even remember how many letters on the screen would fit. It wasn't terribly good, and it was hazy, and it was horrendous. And the really interesting thing is, that was around, well, 1980, yeah? It had 1 megahertz CPU, and it had, well, one CPU, of course, and it had 1 kilobyte of memory. And how much storage, you might ask? None. I could connect a cassette tape, and at that point, you could very slowly load and save programs, which of course were tiny because you only had 1K of memory. To compare that with my phone, which I've luckily put away, my phone has 8 CPUs. It runs on something in the range of 1.4 gigahertz, so 1400 megahertz. So that is 1400 times as fast as that in terms of clock speed. And instead of 1K of memory, it has somewhere between 32 and 64 gig of memory. It has so much memory, I don't even care how much memory it has until it runs out of space again, of course. So it has like thousands or millions of times as much power as that device. And that's a while ago. That's 40 years of history. So I've lived through all of that. So it gives me a bit of perspective of where we come from. And yes, I used to have to tinker with this stuff. There were no ready-made apps for these things. I had to build it. And of course, we abused that very, very expensive piece of business machinery that somehow someone had extracted out of a university in Amsterdam and put in the basement, in a cooled basement, because otherwise that thing wouldn't run. Lots of ventilators and actual aircon in Amsterdam is rare. You know, it's not necessary, it's cold enough. That basement had aircon. It needed to be kept cool to keep that thing running, and it was at the bottom floor of what we could now call a hackerspace. On the ground floor, there were people soldering. And we'd go out cycling and hiking and whatever, all that kind of stuff. So like a youth activity thing, but also hacking and programming. That's where I learned my programming. Okay. Then how did I get online? I really did like the War Games movie at the time. I find it rather insightful, the evil you could do. It's an interesting movie. I'm not saying it's a dreadfully good, it's a really good depiction of what online activities should be like or are like. That's not what it's about. But it's an interesting operation, an interesting exploration of what can go wrong when people trust too much in computers and how other people can get involved, but also on how online interactions go, funnily depicted as they were. So from there, I got actually borrowed, I don't really remember who I borrowed it from, but I caught a modem from someone, and my first modem looked like that. I actually had to plug in the real telephone receiver, yes. Who here has done that? Oh, that's actually quite, you're old. You're all old, just as old as I am. Yeah, that's it. And this was in the time when you still had to dial a number, actual dial. It was pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago that when I depict a telephone, I do that. When young kids up to 10, 15 years old do that. Why did they do that? Because this is what the phone looks like now. Isn't that interesting? It's a cultural change. Look around you and see when this happens, and you can actually see the cultural shift. So I was mucking around with bulletin boards, you know, online chatting, messaging, exchanging files, and generally just tinkering around. FidoNet was one of the on dial-up telephone networks, computer networks. It was global. One of the pieces of software I was using in FidoNet turned out to actually have been written by Ryan Werner's father, who was writing special driver software for this network. It's awesome. I didn't know that, and at some point he came up to me at a linux.conf and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so," and it's like, okay, is that how that connects? So that was decades later. Awesome. Okay, I got onto the internet well before the web existed, because the internet is much older. In fact, the internet is older than I am. So the point is, I've been mucking around with tech a heck of a long time, so that's my street cred. I normally don't mention that because, you know, people just do their talk and they get their own cred from whatever they're saying. I needed to provide this bit of background because I'm now going to bash up the supposed experts. Okay, tablets, aren't they wonderful? Who here has tablets, uses them? Okay, about half the room, mumble. Yeah, okay. So I see a heck of a lot of tablets around. I do workshops in primary schools sometimes, and also sometimes in high schools, more primary schools. And one I found, and yes, I do know all the school names here. I'm just trying to protect them and myself from too much embarrassment. But yes, I know a state primary school in Brisbane, in an affluent suburb, I'll say, that does BYO iPad. And I think the affluent suburb is the key there. I don't quite know what they do with those iPads. What I do know is that the kids spend most of the time on it, including when they shouldn't be. And this is a cause of great concern to the teacher, who spends much of his time trying to get the kids to either put the iPad away or not start the apps that they shouldn't be starting at that particular time. So, you know, keep that in your mind. I know some major state and private high schools that have all their students use iPads. Now, there's one advantage I see there, potentially, and that is that their backpack can be lighter because they're not carrying all the big books around. That's the good bit. Any other good bit? I haven't been able to find, and we'll get back to that. So here are the facts. Steve Jobs himself didn't allow his kids to use iPads. That's just a fact. No one's particularly asked him, and otherwise he might have given a marketing answer anyway, but the point is, he didn't give his kids iPads. That's not the best marketing, possibly, but maybe he had a reason. Maybe he knew something that other people are not willing to accept. In the US, though, since 2015, iPad sales have been on the decline. Interesting. You know, there's no particular plan involved in that. It is just schools deciding that that is not the way they want to be going now. Maybe it was the cool thing, and now it's no longer the cool thing, which is also an interesting lesson. If it was a really good thing, it would have stayed. But because it was just a cool thing and not necessarily a more useful thing, it's a fad and it fades away. Interesting. So the other problem is, and many of us here, of course, most of us will understand this, a tablet is a consumer device. You don't do programming on it. You can muck around a bit with stuff inside applications, but it's not actually something you do the programming in. If you want to do program on a tablet, you actually use a laptop or a desktop device with which you write the application that then runs on the tablet. There may be exceptions now, but that is the general flow of things. It is a consumer device, fundamentally. And yes, you're nerdy enough. I see some cringy looks. I'm simplifying it a little bit for the conversation. Here's the real problem. There are kids arriving at kindy and primary school who are not able to properly handle a pencil. They can't hold a pencil and do drawings, coloring in, and that kind of stuff. This is not my observation. This is the observation of primary school teachers, early learning experts. Yeah, they get kids, and they've been surprised over the last 5+ years that these kids are now arriving. Why? Well, we know the why. They haven't held pencils. It is very straightforward. Why haven't they held pencils? Because they've been holding iPads and mucking around on there. So they can draw, but they can draw with their fingers or with a mouse. They cannot draw with a pencil. Now, you can have your own opinion on whether or not that's a good idea. I think it's a really, really bad idea. And it's not intentional. These are not bad parents. But those were choices, and these are the consequences. So possibly not the best idea. So onto laptops. Are laptops perhaps better? Well, let's see. Inevitably, laptops in schools have a problem. If they run out of battery, you need to plug them in. You do not simply have the facilities in existing classrooms that get shuffled around all the time to plug things in. Therefore, the laptop needs to last the entire day. So what happens is the CPU gets downgraded. For the nerds, usually school laptops end up being i3s. Why? Because i5s and i7s use more battery. Now, it's a bit of a simplification again, but that is the choice that the school IT departments or the education departments make. And again, we can have an argument with them, but remember the Linux argument, this is better, you should do this. It doesn't get followed. That's not how it works. So they make a choice based on battery life and weight and size, and as a consequence, you don't get the performance. Always the performance will suffer, and you will not get the resolution you want to do the graphics you want, and so on. So you actually have quite a limited device relative to the technology that we have available and the tools that you could be using. If you have a laptop that uses Microsoft Windows, it in a way gets even worse because it gets locked down in a way that not many of our corporate environments are even locked down. The way those things are locked down is such that every single thing that the kid could possibly go and explore or change anything is not allowed. That is a lot of policies, which means that the login procedure actually takes a long time. Now, with BYO laptops, that doesn't often happen, but if the laptop is hosted at or is based at the school itself, it's a school-owned laptop from the education department or from the private school itself, it takes between 5 and 50 minutes to log in. I kid you not. I didn't make this up, I've observed this. Now, imagine an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old who has to log in at the start of a lesson. How much attention span do they have, and are they willing to wait for this? The answers are not very much and no. It doesn't work. And if they can't log in, what happens to the lesson? What happens to whatever they actually need to do should they have been able to log in? It never happens. So it can completely destroy a lesson plan, but in the best case, it just delays lessons, yeah? It delays an hour by 5 to 15 minutes in cleaning things up and making sure that everything works. That's a complete waste of time. Teachers are already short on time, okay? I'll skip the Mac bit. They're lovely machines, but again, locked down in a different way. So how about we use a laptop for better purpose? Note-taking. Actually, research shows that this is a really, really bad idea. And I'm very pleased that not only at this conference, but also a number of other conferences in IT and elsewhere, also in archaeology conferences recently, please turn that off, people are using notepads to make notes rather than type in on their laptop. So the test here was between a number of groups. One group, this is from memory, but you can look it up or ask me for the paper. I've got it on my laptop. One group was possibly, what was it, not taking any notes at all. One group would, no, it must have been 4 groups. One group would not take any notes at all. Another group would make notes and throw them away. Yeah, so make all the notes, but after that, they just toss them. And then another group would make notes and look at them afterwards, so review them. And one group would make notes on a laptop and was also allowed to review them. They possibly had more groups to have more distinction, but these are the key ones. As it turns out, the ones that took notes did best, regardless of whether they threw them away or not. So it's the writing down that makes your brain remember, not the revising afterwards. That's the key. It's the most important bit. Of course, revising has a benefit, but the key is the actual exercise of writing it down. And teachers actually learn this. I learned this years ago. I'm not a professional teacher, but I've done training. And I would have people write down stuff I wrote on the whiteboard, even though my students would complain, why don't you just hand us the slides so we don't have to write all this stuff down? And I would explain to them, the fact that you're writing it down helps you remember. And they grumble and they do it anyway. And this is the same way with kids. And I don't think teachers or schools in general should actually let people the kids get away with oh, just give me the slides. It's not a good plan because that. So when it comes to evidence-based, school systems and learning and so on, we should take into account the actual evidence. That might actually be a really, really good idea. So taking notes on laptops, not a good plan. Very related, mind maps. Who here uses mind maps? Yeah, not many, but some of you. Okay, so using a mind map on an app completely ignores the way a mind map works. I'll leave it there. It just doesn't. It's fundamentally, it's a tech indulgence. You need a piece of paper with a couple of coloring pencils and go for it. That is the process. It doesn't work on a computer. Okay? Sure, you can write an app, but it doesn't mean it actually does the job properly. So next thing, kind of staying on the laptops, and some of you may have seen a variation of this slide before. So schools saying we must use brand or product X, in particular software. For instance, we must use Microsoft Office. We must use AutoCAD. I mention those names because these are the arguments that are actually being held at schools. There's many more, but those are some of the key ones. Okay, so you may ask, being a critical nerd that I am, you may ask why. And the answer is because it's the industry standard. Well, that's a very interesting answer. I get it, yes. Most desktops do have Microsoft Word running. Most designers will be at some point exposed to AutoCAD. But does that actually matter? What are the side ideas around that? So here's the analogy. If you learn how to drive a car, do you learn how to drive a car, or do you learn how to drive a particular model of a particular brand from a particular year? The answer is you learn how to drive a car. The only distinction is whether you learn to drive an automatic or a manual. That's about it. Okay? And the idea is that when you learn how to drive a car and you're competent in that, you will be able to drive another car. Now, you will be more comfortable with the cars that you have more experience in, but that doesn't mean you can't drive the other cars. So the fact that it's the industry standard is absolutely not a reason. In fact, it may be the reason to not do that, because you might train people on the particular tricks of that product rather than teaching them the generic skill of being able to, well, drive a car, use a word processor, or whatever. And Microsoft itself has explained this brilliantly. Thank you, Microsoft. Yeah? You get a new version of the software, and my goodness, it's changed. And we've always known this, and then a couple of years ago, at some point in a computer store, I spotted that, and I had to take a picture because that points it out so clearly. I've seen versions of Microsoft Office change so much in the user interface from one version to the next that I didn't know where to find stuff. Now, that also means that the users who are trying to do something, they've learned I need to click here, here, and then there, are now lost and need to be retrained. That also means they've been incorrectly trained. They learned, open this menu, click there, they've opened that menu, click there, and that is not the skill. It's a monkey trick. It's a step, 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 and if any of the steps change, they're lost. And sometimes computers do weird things because other things come pop up or so on, and it goes wrong and they're completely lost. That is not learning, that is not knowledge, that is not skill. It's a waste of time. So why are we doing it in classrooms? For goodness sake, we're trying to get these people ready for the real world, and apparently we're not. So here too, research has happened, and funnily enough, this has happened a long time ago. About 16 years ago in South Australia, they've already looked at this, and they did an experiment between GIMP and Photoshop. They looked at more. They also were using OpenOffice, and you have to, you know, most of you here will use OpenOffice now, and it's actually a pretty decent product. Imagine 16 years ago, it was horrendous. Yeah? It wasn't the prettiest piece of engineering, and GIMP has come a long way since, and of course Photoshop has as well. So we're not talking the now software, we're talking the then software. But the same still applies. You could run the same experiment, it would still hold. What happens is that, okay, I'll first tell you about the two groups. These two groups, there were two units, and one of the groups would start with the one unit on Photoshop, and the other group would start on the one unit with GIMP. And then in the next unit, they'd swap. Okay, swap in terms of the tool set used. As it turned out, each of the groups preferred the tool they used first. Why? Because they're more comfortable with it. Makes perfect sense. I'm more comfortable with certain things. If I have to do something else, there's an adaptation. Humans really don't like that kind of change. So there's a bit of hesitance and getting used to it, and it takes a little bit of extra time and so on. That's all there's to it. So it really doesn't matter whether we use GIMP or Photoshop. What matters is that we learn the skill, but in the real world, we're very likely to get even a new version of either GIMP or Photoshop, or maybe some company uses something else. Do we want to be only trained on that one product? Probably not, because at that point, we're not ready for the workplace. And we all know those workplaces change ridiculously fast. They will not be using next year what they'll be using today. And particularly when kids are at high school now, in many cases, it'll be 10 years before they're out there in the workforce. 10 years is a heck of a long time in IT. People will not be using the same thing. They need to have the skills, not a particular tool in their toolbox. Okay? So, and this article is actually, this report is quite difficult to find if you have trouble finding it. I managed to find it on my laptop this afternoon, so I know I have it still. Okay, so that's where it is. It's not a published paper, it's a report done for the South Australian Education Department, but it is online. So anyway, ask me if you need to. So one of the issues that you can observe from how schools operate with IT is risk aversion. And it's not just primary schools or high schools, it's universities. So we found out in the course of our communications with people, so my wife Claire is an archaeologist, it turns out that undergraduate archaeology students at the University of Queensland do not do any field work. How does that work? I have no idea, but it seems really strange. There's now sniggering in the ranks there, absolutely that. I'm just appalled and astonished, and I can only laugh about it, otherwise I'd cry, but it's not good. And at QUT, which is self-declared university for the real world, electronic engineering students don't touch a soldering iron until third year. How does that work? To give you an example, that's my daughter Caroline, and here she is age 10, 11, year 5 in primary school. This is at school, a state school in Brisbane. and C is soldering in the classroom. Yeah? So this is the answer to the conversation earlier of at what age can you actually trust people with a soldering iron? About that age, I think, is good. 10, 11. Younger than that, they don't quite have the coordination and the attention and so on. Older than that might actually be too late. So what I heard earlier from Wes was that at age 15, you know, there were actually some problems with kids actually getting used to the handling of the soldering iron and so on. Maybe there's different things going on at that age. This seems to be, by pure luck, the correct time that the exposure actually really works. What we did find, so this was a project I did with robotics, and yes, they were soldering their own robot together. It was a little turtle robot. I'll show you a little bit later about that, because it's not the main focus of this talk. I'm just using it as an example of what kids can actually do if you let them. They were soldering that robot, and as it turns out, 10 and 11-year-old girls have a slightly longer attention span and more attention to focus on that work than boys do at that age. That's also not new, but you know, the things we learn and just observe, but they were both safe. What we did have to do early on, we had the rest, so we had groups of about 4 or 5, you know, less than 6, kids with the one soldering and then the other one standing around to see what they were doing. That seemed like a really good idea, you know, one doing it and the others observing. That works for most, except for the class clowns. The class clowns have an audience at that point, and dreadful things happen. So we changed that really, really quickly because class clowns, an audience, and a soldering iron do not mix. I have to say, in all the projects that I've done in that robotics thing, only some hair got singed, and that was, you know, very, very minor, and you know, it has the smell of burnt hair. Who cares? It's okay to take risks. I don't mind if my kids bump their head, break an arm, graze something, poke themselves with scissors. I don't mind. You know, if you really wanted to do a nasty risk assessment inside a school, do a risk assessment. Someone suggested sand. Apparently sand is dreadful. But to keep it simpler, the humble pencil. Yeah? If you were to have to write up a risk assessment on a pencil, you wouldn't be able to write it all. It's as simple as that. You couldn't allow them in the classroom. So soldering irons are easy. You know, yes, we had to write something up. It's one side of paper and it's done. And yeah, you have to explain to kids how it works. And I actually did send the soldering iron around the classroom while unplugged, holding it by the wrong hand, so they could get it out of their system. Problem solved. Yeah, because otherwise someone will start and try it and fry their hands. But, you know, if that happens, it's still okay. You tend to let go. Anyway, never happened, but the point is, look, our son long ago, you know, hot, was Max, wasn't it? Yeah, hot stove, and he had to touch it anyway. There's some kids that do that. So you need to take that into account and make sure they can do that in a safe manner. But after that, they're over it. Telling them you can't get anywhere near, it's like putting the red button here and saying you can't press it. It doesn't work. You know, you work with how the kids think. Okay, so web-based resources. Let's move on from the soldering fun. So web-based resources can be really good, potentially. However, does the average school have 100 megabit? Not a chance. Should they have more? Yes, because if you had 100 megabit and you had 500 students, and that's actually a relatively small school, yeah, so I'm giving them fairly high bandwidth, I'm giving them not many students, that means they have 200 kilobit per student to use, and you have 20 kilobytes a second, which is very, very slow. That snail is an accurate depiction. It wouldn't even be a happy snail. Yeah, it is not good. And you think, oh, but not all students use that at the same time. Really? So all these laptops are on the desk all the time, and they need to be used. And the teachers will nod at me now, and this is how it works at the moment. They will be doing stuff, not necessarily what they have to be doing, but they'll definitely be online. So yeah, that's how that works. And this is a problem. And I'm not even touching the whole NBN, no bloody network problem. It's well beyond that. It is very difficult to have enough bandwidth in a building. At linux.conf we know this. So we never ask the building facilities itself to deliver us bandwidth, because we know it doesn't work. We get the university network ARNet in to rearrange the entire network to provide us with something fancy. If it's not nearby, they'll create a microwave link to the nearest university where they do have the bandwidth, they'll work it out. And that is why we all can work on our computer at the same time and actually check our email and do our complicated stuff and even upload videos after they've just been recorded. All that is possible, but it's a very unique situation. Most schools don't have that. Their bandwidth is dreadful. So the more you do online, the more fancy things you do online with videos and interactive stuff, it doesn't work. It fundamentally cannot work. And that is if you have a good connection. Now, where do we get good connections? Actually, Longreach in central West Queensland has a good connection. As to why, I do not know. But Chermside, which is a northeastern suburb in Brisbane, has a dreadful connection. So it's not just the inner cities that have the best connection, but the fact is many places actually have more dreadful connections, and some people have no connection at all. So NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy, wants to go online. Why? I don't know. It's probably for the benefit of people marking it because it's more convenient. That's great, but it doesn't work. And I've been connected with a couple of schools that have been part of the trials. Some have now opted out of the trials because they're fed up, and others are just, yeah, we'll play with it, but we've got the paper ones as a backup, and that's always been wise so far because they've needed it. It doesn't work. It's not good. And the equipment can fail, the connection can fail, and it just all goes wrong. Other reasons for possibly not doing the web-based stuff is why are we outsourcing the teaching? What's wrong with the teachers? And whether there's the teacher teaching something directly or whether they're a mentor in the classroom, having the kids all go off on their own with a web app, how is that better than a good teacher in the classroom? I don't think it's better at all. I think it's a really, really dreadful idea. Would we be happy if there was an iPad here, put it there and it had my face on it and it would be telling you that story? It wouldn't work. Even though you can say in theory it's as good as. It's not really as good as. Me being here in person talking to you is a completely different experience from seeing the same thing on a recording. I like having a recording, but it's not the same thing as being in a room. There's a different experience there, and think about that. Gamification, or as earlier Roland mentioned, edutainment. Why? I've heard back from a company that actually built an online app, and they did some research on it. This was connected to a university. They did some research on it, and the research showed that the kids were engaged with that particular app, and therefore they regarded it as a success. So I thought about that a bit. It's like, that sounds good, but that's not the point. Whether or not the students engage with the app is not the point. What did they get out of it? Not mentioned. And that worries me, because if there was an actual educational gain, I would bet you that they would have mentioned it, because it sounds even better than the fact that there was engagement. So I can only conclude that there only was engagement and no educational gain. That's a bummer, because that's kind of what the kids were supposed to be doing in school time. It's just an idea, but I don't know. Anyway, so what's the consequence of all this stuff? Well, again, I talk to teachers sometimes, and imagine primary school teachers in a classroom of about 25 kids. They have 10 or more now online facilities that they need to go to. The kids lose their usernames and their passwords all the time. They're only primary school kids. What do you expect? Yeah, these are year 1s or year 5, but it doesn't matter. So the teachers maintain a spreadsheet with about 250 usernames and passwords. Can you imagine that? These are not sysadmins with the proper tools. These are high school, mainly primary school teachers with a spreadsheet. They've got other stuff to do. This is horrendous. And if they need to reset someone's password, they need to go in. And of course, on some days, half the kids lose their password. What do you do? Yeah, it's not a good thing. It actually, again, hinders the teaching rather than helping it. Who knows about these little critters? They're lovely, aren't they? They cost about 14K each. Yeah, I know a number of Brisbane schools that have 2. They can dance. Educational benefit? I don't know. I'm sure you can do educational things with them. You know, I could grab that chair and do educational things with it, but that doesn't make it an educational tool by definition. That robot is not an educational tool. It is a wonderful product that apparently sells really well for 14K, and the only ones that get the benefit out of that is the company that produces it. And I'm sure they're doing really great, but I don't care. I care for my kids' education. That's not it. No, I haven't. I've seen others use it, which is, you know, okay, the question was, have I used one? No, I've seen kids use it, and the most common thing is that they make them dance. And yeah, you can make them walk around. There's all kinds of things you can do with them. As I said, I'm absolutely not opposed to them. No, I know they can be used for educational purposes, but that's not the point. The point is that they cost $14,000, and after that you might be able to do something educational. So if you buy two for a school, you've already spent $28,000 without any of the training or whatever involved in maintenance and other stuff before you're anywhere. And then you need to start educating. That's a lot of money. You know, if you want to do that, that's fine, but I'm saying possibly not necessary. It's a bit indulgent. This one is a bit bigger. I know a school in Brisbane. Look, I love 3D printers. I have hung out with Vic ever since 2006, since he came to Dunedin linux.conf and was telling, I've got this contraption here, and he showed the glue gun, and it's gonna do hot plastic, and it's gonna draw things, and it's gonna make 3D models, and that's what the RepRap project ended up doing. You know, a year and a half later, he actually had something dreadful working, and it became better and better, and now, how many of us actually have a 3D printer at home? Yep, there you go, that comes from there. So, you know, and that's only 14 years ago that those things, well, they were corporate, big, enterprisey ones, but not the really cheap ones. That's really changed over the last 14 years. So I'm all for 3D printers, but as an exploratory tool, as something you learn how to tinker with and learn how those things work. It's not like inkjet printer, laser printer, 3D printer. It is like a workshop lathe. You need to learn how to use it, how to maintain it, how to tweak it, how to calibrate it, and all that. So what does this high school in Brisbane do? They acquired a 3D resin printer. So that's not a regular 3D printer, it's one of those ones that prints in resin. So it comes up with fancy things like, whoops, like that. Anyway, he was really excited because he didn't have to pay for it in a single year. I heard this from the principal himself. And he could pay for it in 3 years. And that's when he said, yep, sold. So why did he buy it? Any ideas? It is the latest cool thing. But translated to the mind of a principal, prestige. The neighbors don't have one, and it looks cool, so they're doing the best education thing. But that's a really weird way of presenting yourself. Surely you can do better than that. So yes, prestige. So on to another thing. Let's muck around with virtual reality. Other online things, yes, another great topic. You know, you can muck around with headsets, and you can spend thousands of dollars again, spend a lot of time on it. And again, you can do great educational things with it. But purely spending money on it, does it actually improve education? Well, there's a number of problems with it. It's not the same as physical touch. And there's a lot of kinesthetic kids. Yeah, they need to touch and muck around with stuff to actually get anywhere. So it's not optimal for their learning. It's also not safe. The fact that you're not actually in the real world getting your hands dirty, potentially getting your fingers burned by a soldering iron or greasy or cutting yourself or whatever doesn't make it safe. Yeah? Because when you play a game, if you play a first-person shooter and you get shot, you have a very similar chemical emotional reaction to a person who actually gets shot. The difference is that you're not actually shot. But the emotional response is actually there and the chemicals are there, and you will experience similar physiological harm in a way, having gone through that experience, because the getting shot is only minor effect. You know, you can take the bullet out, you can dress it, and it will heal. The emotional damage is much worse, and that's the bit you do get in the first-person shooter game. Just as an example. Now, we're not playing first-person shooter games in VR, but you get the idea. It is not a safe environment per se. Yeah? So even if you're risk averse, this is probably not the way to go. And as another extreme example, how many of you use Facebook? Yeah, if you're willing to fess up. Facebook is actually quite a dangerous online thing. It has been shown that using Facebook has your body release dopamine. Dopamine is a very, very serious drug which is addictive. It's like, you know, it's like taking nibbles of morphine while you're mucking around somewhere. It's not a good idea. So, yeah, and yet we use Facebook. It's
what about
tricky.
overflow?
Yes, probably exactly the same thing. We'll get back to that. And kids often prefer the real thing, and I'll give you an example. Now, my daughter, who was there at OSTC 2009, long time ago? Yeah, a couple of you. Okay. So my then 3-year-old Phoebe did a little demonstration of her little EPC. And, well, she must have been 4 then. She had the EPC since she was 3, so that she had a bit of experience at that point. I did the talking, she did the demonstrating, and that was quite good at the lightning talk. So I was looking back at that to review what was going on with this talk, and a little note from back then stuck with me. At some point, I showed her solitaire, you know, the online card thing, online on the computer. And I showed her how it worked, and she thought it was quite interesting, and he said, can we do that with real cards? So I showed her with real cards, and we played it with real cards. Kids often prefer the real thing. Why not? What is wrong with the real thing? Why do we need to do it on the computer? Because it's possible. Holding the cards, there's actually a benefit to that. I long ago, you know, early computer times, because it was possible, you know, you get online golf and tennis and all those things. I still don't see the point, and I'm dreadful at it. I'm also dreadful at the real world golf or tennis, but at least it's real, and I'm out there and I'm walking around a bit and I'm having a laugh. I don't see the point of putting that into the virtual. Okay? Now, I've just mentioned things about dopamine. This. Why should we not let our kids on the laptop all the time, where we know that the teacher can't actually control exactly where they're going? Why are we letting them on the phone during all those hours of the day and at home? These are the facts. And if you're ponderous about it, I've got the book right there. The Arjen book. You can have a browse during the week, and you know, I'm not letting it out of my sight, but you can order your own copy and have a good read. There's a lot of information in there. And there's a lot of interesting and good stuff, but there's also some horrendous stuff. Now, the way Jean Twenge goes over things is she's observing different generations, and this is not the only generation she's observed. She looks at a chunk of ages and observes certain patterns in those ages. And she doesn't judge them, she just observes them. And then we can learn from that. Well, one of the lessons is, at the moment, that being on any social media at all is apparently harmful to your mental health. Yeah? If you're not on social media, your mental health is better off than if it is. There you go. More than 30 minutes a day, and it becomes increasingly damaging. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to the graph easily, so I'm just describing it to you, yeah? So any is harmful, more than 30 minutes is increasingly damaging, and more than 2 hours a day, or if you're talking about your well-being, down off the cliff, yeah? Not good. So are our kids often more than 2 hours a day on the telephone? What do you reckon? How are your kids doing? Are they more than 2 hours online? Any time of day, thank you very much. Yes. So at our house, around dinner time, the telephones, the mobile phones and the laptops, they all go into the parents' bedroom and they stay there. Yeah? There's many other reasons for that, but you know, you can talk to me, it's a whole other topic, but that might be a good idea. I'm taking this back to the classroom. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to have the kids use their mobile phones and their laptops all the time, because they're not doing what we think we're doing, because they're actually quite tech savvy. They're generally more tech savvy in the sense of using certain apps than the teacher is in actually catching them. And it's not the teacher's job to catch them out on savvy apps, it's the teacher's job to guide their education, right? So that's what we want them to be doing. So them spending more time on social media chatting with their friends that are not at the same class or whatever is probably not a good plan. Let's not enable that, okay? This is what that kind of stuff leads to, and you may recognize some of that stuff. Is this about phone addiction or online addiction? No, this is about addiction in general. It really doesn't matter whether it's alcohol, drugs, or phones. And some of us actually exhibit this behavior. And many parents do. And I know, because, again, putting it back to a school, at the school event, I'm happy to hand out the slides if you're interested in taking photos. Why not? Yes, and Peter is writing it down himself. That is absolutely right. That is very good, yes. And you can Google this yourself or, DuckDuck or whatever search engine you prefer. Going to school events, for instance, I see a sports event and there's kids running by or swimming or whatever. What are the parents doing? Any ideas? Videoing. Wouldn't that be great? No, they're not looking at the kid at all. They're looking at their phone, which is down there, and they're probably talking to their Facebook friends. They're not actually there. What does that do to the kid? Not good. Yeah, it is really, really, really not good. There's other examples of this, but to me this is an example of total fail. Is that a bad parent? Yeah, I think they're stuck somewhere. And I would call it addiction, and they need to get rid of it. But that's really important for their kids. So that's why I'm telling you there in the camera. So all that brings me to that. I assert that we're actually churning out qualified ignorance at the moment. Qualified in the sense of the people get a piece of paper. They're graduated from something. They have a degree in something. But actually ignorant as. And I know this because I'm also a business person, and I have been an employer, and I now, I recruit for the local branch of the company I work for. And even if I look at university graduates or people who graduated some time ago or people who are about to graduate, there's not a heck of a lot there who are actually capable of functioning in the environment that I need them to function in. And they do have a degree that is, somewhat related, computer science and programming. I need them to do computer science and programming. It should match up. It's not. And one of the tests that the company uses during the recruitment process is a FizzBuzz test. We asked them to write a program, there's some nods there. We asked them to write a program to count from 1 to 100, and if the number is, you print the number, except if the number is divisible by 3, print fizz. If the number is divisible by 5, print buzz, and if it's divisible by 3 and 5, print FizzBuzz. And you put neat commas in between and a carriage return at the end. This seems like a really easy game. You could program that. You wouldn't believe how many people do not manage to either get it done or do the most horrendous things. It's a logic test, it's a thinking test, and it's really, really problematic. And if people are not able to do that, will they be able to deal with more complex problems? That is the real thing. So I don't care whether someone has a degree. What we really need to do is look at people who can think. I'll get to that in a moment. So when I talk to people at schools, they go on all the time about evidence-based everything. But the parents ask for and demand that, certain tech is used in schools. Well, who made them the experts on that? It's just a snazzy new thing, but it doesn't make it any better. I like tech too. I sometimes like a new toy, but it doesn't mean we have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars putting it in every school. That's a different choice. Yeah? Similarly, parents often demand that students get homework. It's been fairly well researched that more homework does not equal better results. So why would we give them more homework? Why doesn't the teacher say, well, it's interesting you mentioned that, but our educational research shows that that doesn't actually work, so we're not. In fact, no homework at all doesn't actually degrade your results either. It's just a different way of teaching. You could have some homework at different levels, you cannot have homework, but the point is that more homework doesn't make it better. So if a parent asks for it, why would you do it? They're not the expert. They're not the educational specialist with that degree. Acquisitions for showing off the prestige, well, we already covered that and are fairly well in agreement. That is not the point. I'm not opposed to a company, to a school having a resin printer or a robot or something else. I think that's pretty cool, but have an actual reason for it. And then replacing teachers with online apps, I don't think it's a good plan at all, and that is effectively being done. So what I'm asking is, can we have some leadership in that educational field where people actually, who do know their stuff, teachers do know their stuff, where they actually stand up and say, no, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing that, because we're the experts, and we actually know what we're trying to do. So here's an example of what happened with the soldering of the little robots. And they were little turtle robots, so they could draw. So that ties into year 5 and 6 maths. And that has to do with angles and all that, yeah? So, some of the early exercises are, draw a square, which is interesting because you need to know which way you turn, and depending on how you're thinking at that point, you may actually create a stairway zigzagging rather than making a square at first. It gets more complex. It gets more complex. So one of the things, we toss some ideas out there, but the kids have the opportunity to explore. Now, there's a couple of things we discovered there, and that is some kids that actually needed teacher aides to help them with maths and English, but in particular maths in this case. They were actually able to work through the exercises and solve significant complicated problems on their own with these robots. Now, we had a look at that, and this is not particularly scientific, but they were able to try something on their own, explore, they were allowed to make mistakes. The result was directly visible in front of them in the form of a line having been drawn. They didn't have to ask the teacher, is this correct or not, because they could see that whatever they were trying to do didn't work, right? So they had a laugh about it and did something else. And they came out with the most wonderful solutions. Now, this result is not one of those solutions, but it is a nifty little thing. I for pure frivolity, put in make an n-pointed star in the workbook. And some of the kids did. And it is a really, really short program. And I taught them to write pseudocode because the actual mechanism here was mostly a visual programming thing, which I didn't really like. So I taught them pseudocode so they could actually write it down and actually debug it. That's the pseudocode. So a loop of 8 times, and then the block is forward 75 points, 75 mils, left turn 135 degrees. They worked it all out. How did they know the 135 degrees? They either calculated it or worked it out by trial and error. Either way, they got there. That is just robot error sliding on the piece of paper. Okay, so that's what we need, I think. My throat is misbehaving. I'll take a break.
So, does anyone have any questions or comments or?
Okay. What's your thoughts on books on tablets? So students have tablets, or look, it doesn't really matter what the device is, textbooks on tablets.
Textbook, maybe. Reading book, no. It's a light device, so particularly in the evening, not a good idea.
First, I want to give an answer to that question. My wife is a school librarian, and she found that in changing from textbooks to tablets, there are very big problems in the publishing industry. Firstly, not all of the resources that the teachers wanted were available as ebooks. Some of them were, some of them weren't. And so because they were limited to ebooks, they had to make compromise on the quality of the material. Secondly, they had to deal with many, many, many publishers. And of course, doing that with a physical book is easy. You just buy the book and it's on your shelf. But when you do many publishers with an ebook, you have to have many apps. And not only do you have to have many apps, you have to have many administration apps for those apps, because students lose passwords and so on and so on. Anyway, I just wanted to have that little rant for you. My question is about this less strict teaching path. How much of an issue do you think that the national curriculum is creating for us there by putting sort of very strict boundaries on what must be taught and how it must be taught?
I'll actually answer that on Arjen's behalf. He's just had to nip out. And I can actually do that because I've looked at the curriculum in great detail. I actually created a implementation of the history and science, the humanities and science curriculum for primary schools. The national curriculum is actually awesome. It is fantastic. It is incredibly comprehensive. It is very open-ended. You can approach it from the most, I looked at it and I went, wow, to implement the humanities section, you pretty much need a PhD in archaeology and humanities subject. It's like, wow, it's really amazing. About 10% of it gets taught in our schools. And that's the problem. There's very little, probably because it is so huge and potentially all-encompassing. There are very few lesson plans that address the national curriculum. And so teachers just use the sample ones. I know in Queensland there's a sample on the first fleet. Our kids got it 3 times in a row because it's just too much work to produce it. So I don't think it's the curriculum that's the hindrance. I think it's the actual implementation that with so much that teachers have to do and all the admin and stuff, they just don't have the time. So we actually need, I mean, that's why we set up OpenSTEM to kind of provide resources for teachers for certain areas to kind of help out with that. So what we need is a lot of open resources for teachers to be able to use, yeah.
I apologise in advance if this is a rant instead of a question, but that first question triggered me. Electronic textbooks are the most overpromised and underdelivered part of this entire fiasco. We were sold on the idea that our kids would not have to lug tons of dead trees around, but they still did. And the electronic textbook apps are, by and large, horrifyingly bad, DRM encrusted, don't work unless you happen to have a working network. Just say no.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'm interested what you think of the idea of having videos teaching with specific equipment or specific graphics that would be difficult for a teacher to do either on a whiteboard or something, or on a projector. Having a video of someone doing a real physics experiment in a really well set up lab or in some particular like complicated rotating reference frame, which would be very hard to do in an ordinary classroom, might be a more valid use of videos than just recording every lecture. Do you think there are particular styles of videos that would work better?
I think it's the context in which it's presented. So in Arjen's title, he said gratuitous use of tech. And I think the basic point is that how it's used. If you've got, a scenario where the kids are trying to do something and you want to show them this can help you learn how to do X, Y, Z. This can help you learn to use the equipment that you want to use to do the problem, to address the problem that you're trying to solve. Brilliant, because we can't always demonstrate that in the classroom or in the situation. So it's about how you use it. As Arjen said, you can make a chair educational, depending on the context. It's just how it's used. If it's just, I'm going to switch on the video and I'm going to go and read Facebook on my phone for 20 minutes, then that's not.
You can do actual videos, keep them short.
I remember being at school and we had real films and with people in white coats demonstrating science, and we used to run the film projector, and then sometimes the teacher would step out and then we'd run it backwards and watch it in reverse and have a great time.
Do you have any comments on the privacy implications of kids using web-based tools? I mean, I presume most parents just assume that the schools have it figured out, but I think we know in this room that they certainly don't. What do you think?
Yeah, we know that in reality all that stuff is absolutely pitiful in terms of privacy. It's really, I mean, the reason why the schools lock down their environment so hard is to say that they're doing the right thing in terms of that. Personally, there seems to be a kind of disjoint between an understanding of what that really means. So yeah, I think it's always worth asking. And if you put schools on the spot, they get very unhappy very quickly because they don't actually know what they're doing. In a lot of cases, in my experience.
Don't know how much of a question, more of a comment, but I'm a high school teacher and also lecturer at university, do C programming for engineers at uni and digital solutions at high school. And quite often students will walk into my room and be shocked when I say, we're going to learn how to program now, so everyone close their computer. And when we're fixing bugs, get your eyes off the computer and look at me. And yeah, I just wanted to agree with most of those things, that human interaction, getting them away from the actual screen and getting them to think themselves goes a long way. Of course, we use the technology a lot. It's the gratuitous use of it, as you said, that's the issue. So yeah, more of a comment.
Thanks, nice talk. I'm a massive Luddite also. How do you answer the question which goes like this in my house every day? Stop using your device. But Dad, you stare at a screen all day.
Try not staring at it all day. Stare at it all day. Yeah, it's really hard. And it's part of an ongoing, it's an ongoing way in which our society is changing and trying to work out how to do this stuff. Make it a conversation. We try to do that. At the same time, we put very firm boundaries in place in our house. Like Arjen said, they hand the stuff in after dinner.
I mean, like, because we work on computers, so they say,
Yeah.
anytime you're not with me,
Yeah. They assume that we're on there playing games because they are, or that we're really doing something, or if we happen to jump into even Facebook because somebody you know is only on there and you're trying to track down something for work, and they're like, well, see, you're on Facebook, why can't I be on Instagram or whatever? It's really, really difficult. And I don't think any of us have the answers. I think we're all feeling our way and trying to work out what's best. But we really, really need to look at this research because the mental health statistics are just scary. They're just absolutely horrifying. Yep.
Just looking at your earlier slides, like for laptops, your complaint was that they were too slow and the battery life wasn't good enough, and then anything on the web wouldn't work because the bandwidth wasn't enough. Also the textbooks thing with the DRM, it seems like all these are technical problems to be solved, not reasons to put a big cross on the paper. Like, as a technical person, I'd rather see us trying to solve those problems than just say, okay, we give up, we should just go back to paper.
Okay, we're all good? Yeah. Yeah, sorry for the little escape. Should be a little bit better now.
Sorry, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you were talking about the mental health side of things.
Yes, I want to answer that question as well. Sorry, we'll get to that. By the way, I think the whole mental health thing is a whole extra topic that we should probably take beyond here, but you know, it's a whole other talk. I'm not opposed to laptops and I'm not opposed to having things electronically and so on. However, they're not currently solved problems. So putting underpowered laptops into classrooms is possibly not the solution, particularly if they're not getting used for something that has an educational benefit. There are a couple of schools, and not many, and there's a hint there, everybody wants to be with the crowd because the others are doing it. There are some schools that have very explicitly said we're not going to have any laptops. That doesn't mean they have no computers in the school at all, but they don't have the laptop and the tablet thing. And those schools have just fine educational outcomes. So that means that it's not the laptop that helps create the outcome. The laptop is a tool, not the magic wand that helps make the kids do better. So it can be done without the laptop. It can be done with the laptop, but it's often not getting done with the laptop. The laptop doesn't actually benefit. So it's expensive, complicated, and has all these problems. Yes, and I agree with you. If you toss enough money at it right now, you have better battery life and a higher resolution, or we need to wait a while and get companies to produce better laptops that do that kind of stuff. My personal opinion is if you were to run less Windows and more Linux, it would also run better. We know this, but that doesn't mean I want all the schools to suddenly start running Linux on desktop, because there's other problems with that. Does that make sense? The microphone over there?
Sorry. I was just wondering, when you're talking about like the mental health side of things and depression and computer usage and stuff like that, I'm aware that there are like correlations between those things, but I was just curious if you had any more information about direct relationships, because for me personally, I think it's more of a depressed people are more likely to use those sorts of things.
So, okay, I can very directly answer that. The Gene Twenge book is quite clear on this. Facebook causes depression, not the other way around. Depression does not cause Facebook. This sounds a bit quirky in the way that I phrase it, but a depressed person does not use Facebook more often and therefore becomes more depressed. There's a very direct line of people who use Facebook more are more prone to get depressed. And that's a fairly clear line. I can't explain it any better than that, but have a look at the research, and that is where it goes. And Facebook is, in this case, only an example. It actually doesn't matter whether it's Facebook or Stack Overflow. And sadly, I can go back a couple of slides because there. So that was the line I just quoted for myself, but it's not just my line. That is actually a problem. Yeah. So Facebook themselves probably inappropriately and unethically have mucked around with people's timeline to see how they respond. But and in the end, the outcome is that even if you choose to only read uplifting stories, the reading of uplifting stories online is still damaging to your mental health. It doesn't gain you a positive experience. The reason you keep doing it is because it does do chemical stuff with your body, which makes you need more of that, but it's not actually good for you. We do lots of bad things because they're addictive. This is one of them. It's not a good thing at all. And yes, I do online things as well, but I'm now a little bit more aware. That's we're all non-perfect, and we're only just discovering this. I mean, we didn't know when everybody was buying a mobile phone, about 9 years ago and now more, that this was going to be the outcome. But if you look at the broader picture now, the research is coming out that yes, that is the outcome. And there's possible, evolutionary reasons for that, which are probably best discussed, outside of the OpenEdu mini-conf, because it's, it's not really the education thing that it's connected, but it's not the same topic. Okay, one last question perhaps, because I think we're kind of in evening time now.
Sorry, you'll have to just shout it out.
The microphone's gone? Okay.
Experimenting and risk-taking. My daughter's childcare does this wonderful thing. It's called For a School. They go to the park and they use tools. So that's part of what they do.
Physical tools?
Physical tools.
Okay, yeah. Actually, let me give you my microphone. Why don't I do that? You start from scratch, please.
So my daughter, my daughter goes to childcare, and they do this wonderful thing. They go to forest school for a couple of days and use physical tools. That's part of what they do. There's risk-taking. When I first heard that, I kind of jumped, but through explanation, communication, they explain what they do, how safely they do it. So kids between 1 and 5 use hand drills, saws, wood scissors. So I think it's a great thing that I understand it, and when I see the kids enjoying it. My question is a bit, do you have strategies for convincing institutions, schools, universities to
do more experimentation and risk-taking, especially in a pathologically risk-averse society like Australia? Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent question. See, I come from a slightly different society. It's called the Netherlands. And, well, the point is it's another country. And it's not particularly litigious. You know, if you come up with a frivolous claim in a Dutch court, the judge will just tell you to get out and get a life and move on. And that's a completely different approach from Australia and possibly the US, where there's all this risk-averse stuff. I do not have the magical solution because the person you're trying to convince is not the person that created the environment. And someone really needs to stick their head out and kind of cover themselves and you and everybody else around them who is involved for the potential fallout of things. But in most cases, I think the perceived risk is not actually there. As I mentioned, if you do a risk assessment on the humble pencil, you come up with dreadful things, you know, eyes, ears, damage first, and, you know, you can kill people with those things. So, you know, the soldering iron is not the problem. It's the problem that people are not comfortable with soldering irons because they don't live in every house, and therefore we accept the pencil and not the soldering iron. That's my quick version of it. So the schools that I've talked with that were open to doing something didn't need a lot of convincing for me to let them use the soldering iron as well. There wasn't a lot of fuss there. It's the schools that don't want to experiment at all that are, I think, the problem. And you know, you just have the luck of the draw with principals, or you know, there's sometimes a teacher in charge of STEM who can run this thing, or you know, it differs, but you probably need to find the right people. But you know, you could go as far as talk to your local MP and have them talk to an education minister at the state or the federal level and start making some waves. Why not? And, you know, it depends on whether you want to do one thing locally or whether you actually want to make a much broader change. I don't have magical solutions for the broader change, which is why I'm kind of ranting and screaming, saying, look, we can do this differently. But I'm trying to do it in a positive way because I do think schools are doing a lot of good. And, you know, we've seen from the talks earlier today, people are doing awesome things in schools. That is not in dispute. It is just that an awful lot of schools are spending a lot of money and not actually getting the gain that they could be getting. If that same money was spent on other things, including teachers potentially, to make classrooms smaller, just as an example, that school would be in better shape. They would have too fewer robots and no resin printer, but the people would be better off. So, you know, it's choices, and just have to find the right people locally. And sometimes you have a principal that does that, and sometimes you don't. Okay, thank you all.